The Paula Show is on. The Paula Show. Come on, one and all. I extend an invitation to the Paula Show. Join in the conversation. Transforming behavior, recognizing our Savior, overcoming hurdles, achieving dreams. Together we can succeed.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Paula Show. Tonight on set are two historians, Mr. KamaliMannix and Miss Angella Black. We will be speaking about history tonight, from the land of Africa across the Middle Passage to the plantation, emancipation, and reparation. Did you know that there were black slave owners? Well, stay with us on the Paula Show. Lots more coming up. It's going to be a very interesting evening. We'll be right back after this commercial break. Stay with us, please. Thank you for staying with us on the Paula Show. Remember to watch the Paula Show via CTV Channel 2 on Tuesday nights at 9 and Sundays at 1 in the afternoon. The Paula Show inspires, entertains, and transforms behavior. Like me as well on Facebook, The Paula Show. Tonight it's all about our African history. We will be taking you from Africa to the Caribbean, to the plantations, punishment, reparations. Woo! It's going to be a long night. But I have good company, KamaliMannix, historian, and Angella Black, historian as well. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
I am a history teacher and a love of history.
Good.
I've been teaching history since I was 19. I started at Glanville Secondary. I'm now at Sonova Riches Academy, which is a secondary school in Potters. My love of history started because I grew up with a grandmother who used to tell me a lot of stories, because she lived in Antigua and she lived in St. Kitts for about 30 years, and then she returned to Antigua.
Oh,
so then she would have, she would have
yes.
been able to give a lot of stories. I would have given a lot of
Context,
hints.
yes.
And then coming into secondary school, I had a history teacher by the name of Daryl Josiah.
Oh, yes,
who
I know him.
brought history to life.
Antigua Grammar School.
Yes, who brought
Yes.
history to life in the classroom, and you couldn't not be engaged in the class.
So we are next for you.
Where next for me, I am presently in the process of starting a degree.
In
I
history?
am either going to study history or public sector management, but most likely I'm going to end up studying history.
And Miss Black?
My love for history came from two sources, my father and my history teacher. His name was Mr. Merchant from the Clear Hall Secondary School. And again, he brought history to life for us. In fact, whenever I teach the way he taught. He would stand up and he would just speak. And the children, like he's telling a story.
Yes.
Because that's what it is, a story.
A story.
And so that is what fueled my love for history. I have 2 degrees, a first degree in history, and I have a master's in international slavery.
Remnants of slavery exist all around the Americas. We have the locomotive lines that are not in use anymore in Antigua, but in St. Kitts they are, the towers, the sugar factories, and racism as well. It has followed us through the ages. The caste system, lighter is better. I mean,
Colorism.
I'm looking at both you guys. And if we were all on a plantation, we're real tonight.
Yes.
You would fare better than I would fare.
Most likely.
Because I'm black
Yes.
and you guys are half white.
You would be in the field.
Yeah, you would be in the field.
Oh,
And
dear.
I've heard, no, to
field.
be very honest, I've heard lots
Yes.
of people say, oh, you're light skinned, you'd most likely be in the great house. And I'm like, yes, because I would most likely be the result of a slave master and a slave.
Yes.
And that
So-
is, it's actually called miscegenation. So
Yes.
you would be the product of miscegenation, and so would I. But then you might have fared a little better than me because
He's a male because of his
because
gender?
he's of his gender. Well, it depends on how you look at it, your perspective, because a lot in many cases the mixed women would become paramours of or mistresses of the masters, and so it depends on how you would view that. You know, so one could look at it as positive and another could look at it as something negative.
But when we speak about slavery, generally, we speak in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. But slavery was very common in Africa.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
And we don't want to admit it in a lot of instances.
Well, a lot of scholars do, especially in the Caribbean, in Antigua, they do, but not to the extent that they ought to. I find that when they speak about it, it's in a very apologetic manner. You know, slavery existed in Africa, but it was a benign form of slavery. Or slavery existed in Africa, but it is nothing like the slavery that existed in the Caribbean. And, you know, excuses like that. And so the occurrence of slavery is never properly explored, as far as I'm concerned,
Well, we're
in
exploring it
Antigua,
tonight.
in Africa, because of this apologetic viewpoint.
Justification.
And sometimes it's even romanticized. But a slave is a slave is a slave.
As
And
long
you're at
as-
the bottom of the social strata. And if you're at the
Exactly.
bottom of the social strata,
And if you're not
you will be
free,
beaten.
If you're not free, you will
Precisely.
always feel as if
You're
a slave.
bonded.
You're in
Precisely.
bondage.
And so that was the case because what we saw in the Caribbean was, well, the Caribbean and the Americas was strictly chattel slavery, where you're seen as the property of your master.
Yes.
In Africa, I think, you know, Miss Black would have even mentioned that you did have chattel slavery. You had bond servants where, okay, I owe you, or I have some sort of obligation to you. I'll work for you for 20 years. You had slaves who were practically free in every sense of the word. They could go, they could be married, they could have children, they could be educated, they could have very high positions, but at the end of the day, they were property of another.
Prisoners
and so at the
of
end of the
war
day,
were slaves
they would
as
go
well.
back prisoners of war. You had, even before the transatlantic slave trade, you had the sub-Saharan slave trade.
Right.
Slaves would be taken from Central Africa to Northern Africa to the coast to work. You have slaves being taken
Sent to
from
the
Northern
Middle
Africa, sent across the Saharan desert to parts of the world such as India. So it's a
As far as China.
multifaceted situation.
As
Even
far
as
as
China
China.
has slaves in China.
Yes.
So slavery is nothing new or
One of
exclusive
the-
to the Caribbean.
One of the things that I really need to drive home about slavery in Africa is that when the Arabs came into Africa, when they began to invade North Africa, that was in the 7th century. They were the ones who actually brought chattel slavery, the concept of chattel slavery, to North Africa. And in many cases, when they took over a group of people or a nation, they would demand tribute in the form of slaves. And so the trans-Saharan slave trade was the route through which they would get Africans to go across the Sahara Desert. Slaves, salt, gold, and ivory were the main items that were traded at the time. But it was a chattel slavery sort of situation in East Africa and North Africa with the Muslims, because the Quran said you can. Once a person is not a Muslim, you can enslave that person. And chattel slavery did exist. They were property. They were owned by their masters. Some masters gave them quite a lot of freedom, others did not.
And
But
the
they were
children
owned.
born into slavery.
In Mauritania today, you speak to somebody who's a slave descendant, they would tell you, some of them still think that they're slaves. And they say, for generations, we have been enslaved, for generations. So it still continues even to today. But what would happen is that they would practice in some parts of West Africa assimilation. So I am a slave woman, I have a child, my child takes a different status. The child doesn't have the status that I do. Then that child has a child, that child has a different status.
So the status is elevated?
It's elevated in the
elevated.
sense of your freeness for such, if
Okay.
you want.
Yes.
But it does not mean that that child is a free labor. That child is still unfree. So it was, people always say slavery is a peculiar institution.
Yes.
It was a very peculiar institution.
And the women in Africa maintained the food industry.
Yes.
And the men managed the tree
They
industry.
built the tree, they fought the wars, they would handle tree industry, anything that tree, that's for the men. This is in West Africa. They would help to build the houses, and they participated in war. But the women were the ones who went and who farmed. They controlled the
And
food
harvested.
and harvested. And when they did, they would store their food for several months until the next harvest. So,
So they were into food preservation.
food preservation, food cultivation,
Yeah,
the
practically
women.
all
So
facets of
Kamali, you
it.
would say that slavery in Africa was an established system.
It was an established system.
It wasn't anything
It was,
unique.
it was no different to what we had here. Down to the Romans had slaves. Even before you would have had the introduction of West African slaves, you had a system where, to be quite frank, the Romans would have been white people. People majority from Europe,
They would
Europe,
enslave
etc.,
anybody.
etc. They enslaved anybody, including their own.
Yes.
You had white persons from Europe who were slaves to Romans who were considered superior.
Yes.
So slavery in its grand sense is nothing that was so exclusive to Africa,
No.
exclusive to the Caribbean. The same sort of slavery or slave systems or management and domination of people you saw in the Caribbean and in the Americas, it happened in Africa as well.
But it seems as if it was to a worse degree in the Caribbean.
Not
I don't think so.
Not necessarily.
I don't think so.
Not necessarily.
The bad treatment, the murder, the rape, the exploitation, the unconditional labor, the subservience that you saw here, it is the same thing you saw there. Your
So-
master was your master.
So let us give you an example. Let me give you an example. A young lady is captured in West Africa from her people, and she is transported across the Sahara Desert. If she survives, because
Big
in Africa, it is the women that they wanted to enslave for her labor and for her reproductive abilities. If she survives, she would be bought by a master who she does not know, she's away from her family, and she is expected to reproduce for him. I am yet to hear of a historian come and say to us that is rape. But the same girl is taken across the Atlantic and she lands in Antigua, and a white master demands sex of her. She is being raped. It doesn't matter of the color of the person or the race of the person.
Or the circumstances.
Or the circumstances. The fact
Rape is a
rape.
rape.
Rape is
a
rape.
rape is a rape. She is raped. And she has to form new kinship ties that she doesn't want to have. And as soon as possible, they try to get her to have a child, because that is going to hold her there,
So I'm just about ending this segment.
Yes.
And what I'm understanding here from you historians is that black men and the black slave masters in Africa raped their female slaves as well, just as the masses in the Caribbean raped them.
Same thing. Even if you read
they
African
demanded
literature.
sexual favors from them. They
But
demanded
it's rape if I'm not, if it's
I'm
not
glad you're
consensual.
saying that, because-
it's rape if it's not consensual.
precisely.
Thank you for staying with us on the Paula Show. Whether a slave in Africa, a slave in the Middle East, or a slave in the Caribbean, a slave is a slave is a slave. We'll be right back on the Paula Show. Stay with us, please. What was the interest of the Portuguese for starting the slave trade?
Initially, when the Portuguese came around West Africa, it wasn't so much to get slaves. They
Was it
were not
trade in
familiar. It was
ivory?
to find a trade route to India. That was the ultimate thing for the Portuguese, was to find a trade route to India. And as they began to go through the process of circumnavigating Africa,
Yes.
then they saw these strange people, people who look different. And they thought initially the Portuguese would land, kidnap slaves, kidnap Africans, take them back to Portugal. They would sell them into slavery, because in those times, in the 15th century, if you can catch a slave, anybody can become a slave at that time. So the Portuguese began by kidnapping Africans from the coast of West Africa, taking them back to Portugal, then coming back around, and then kidnapping more, until eventually the Africans said to different coastal West African nations, basically said to the Portuguese, listen, if you want a slave, don't be kidnapping my people. come, we will trade with you.
And
so
initially they were trading the beads and the mirrors and the small items.
Yes, they were. They were trading. Initially, these things were
Unknown
a
to
novelty
them.
to
Yeah.
them,
They
you
were
know.
unknown to them.
Interesting. You look into a piece of glass and,
You see
you
yourself
see
rather
reflection
than
and
magic, you know.
yes, magic.
So it was like that, but it didn't stay like that for
very long.
for 400 for very long. That is so true. To say that it stayed like that for 400 years is to
misrepresent.
our African brothers.
And to
Is to
insult
make
the intellect of them
is
as well.
precisely
Because-
Degrade
yes,
them to just basic thinkers.
they were businessmen.
They eventually became good businessmen.
Very good
Yeah.
businessmen.
Very good.
Yeah.
They understood. They knew what a valuable product was. They had discriminating taste for guns, for horses.
So eventually they
For-
started demanding higher end goods.
Yes. In
Furniture
fact,
and-
eventually they began to ask for the measurement that they would use would be an iron bar. And one gun could be worth maybe one iron bar.
Okay.
And so if
So
one
they
gun is worth an
developed a
iron
system.
bar, right, you may have three guns, a slave may be worth 3 iron bars, so you'll give them 3 guns. And so they worked out this through the process of using iron bars.
What I found interesting about it is in Antigua and Barbuda we have something called the Bureau of Standards. We're supposed to regulate
Yes.
and make sure things are proper and pleasing to the consumers.
Yes.
Even before the entire world understood the whole theory of standards, you had African kings and chiefs who had people who were essentially bureaus of standards,
Yes.
who would literally look at something and say, Majesty, this is of no worth. Or can look at them and say, Majesty, this is of worth,
This
these
is
people
of-
deserve slaves.
Yes.
So to say that, okay, it's just that white people went on the coast and took up black people, oh, that's a lie. That's a lie. The Africans were the suppliers. So they were literally the middlemen. We get you the slaves, you get us what we want, and everybody's happy.
And at first they were trading men and boys.
No. Yes, they were trading men and boys.
Yes.
let's-
Because they needed them for labor.
Yes. Let's back up a bit. When when the trans-Saharan trade was going on, inside of Africa, they needed more women.
Yes. To
And so at
reproduce
war,
and-
yes, they would take the children and they would take women. Men, they would kill. Most likely, they would kill the men. But then when the Portuguese came around and the Portuguese said, we will take the men. They
Okay.
gave them the men. But then afterwards, the Europeans realized, no, we need women too. But for
Need
a
to
very
reproduce.
long time, women were in the minority in the Americas. African women were in the minority in the Caribbean as opposed to males.
It is said that the Africans did not know that they were being sold.
Some of them might not have known that. Some of them caught in the interior didn't know what the end result of their lives would be. Many of them did not know that they were going across the sea. Some of them never saw the sea. It was not something that they could understand.
So they were
I mean,
terrified.
yes, I
Yeah.
would say that they were more so terrified than anything else because you're going into a strange canoe that is really, really big and you are going across a
With clouds on it.
It looks like glass.
Yeah.
yes, and you don't know what is happening to
Where
you.
you're
So
going.
you are
Probably like
scared.
traveling in an aircraft for the first time.
Right.
You're buckled
Right.
in.
Yes.
You don't know what to expect. And then there's some turbulence.
Yes.
And you feel as if the aircraft is
You
going
just,
to crash.
well,
And
let's
then
try-
when you've done it,
Especially those brought from the interior, because
Yes.
if you've lived in the interior in your entire life, the
Landlocked
greatest,
countries.
the greatest source of water you might have seen
A
might
river.
be
A
a
river.
river. If you lived in certain parts of West Africa close to maybe Lake
Yeah.
Victoria, you might see a waterfall, a
Yes,
large lake.
yes.
That is it. When you reach to the coast and you're in these
The
slave ports and they
ocean.
bring you out to a boat and you're seeing an endless mass of water, the reality is some of them were honestly
had a heart
probably in
attack.
a stage
They were
of not even
scared.
being able to
They
comprehend
were
what they were
scared.
seeing.
Yeah.
And then if you resist, of course, you will be beaten. You
Yeah.
probably will be killed.
because nobody's understanding
Precisely.
that it's fear.
Precisely. And the treatment of these people from where they were caught to the gate of no return, that was trauma too. Because sometimes you would be closed up for months waiting on a particular ship because the business became so well organized that you had European merchants in business with African traders and merchants, because they didn't trade slaves alone. They traded ivory, they traded palm
Gold.
oil, they traded gold, they traded so many other things on those ships.
Slavery
Okay,
is just one
So
of
it
the
was
many
slave was one of the
lucrative business.
let me
Right.
yeah, slave was one of the commodities.
Commodities.
Yeah.
That is a sick way of saying it, but
It's
it's
the
sad.
truth.
items. One of the
It's
items.
it's really
It's like you go
sad.
to a shop or you go to Amazon and you're selecting
Shirt,
that,
pants,
Slave.
slave,
Yes.
ivory,
Yes.
bucket of soap.
Yes.
Over 12 million people were taken from Africa
Yes.
and transported to the Caribbean.
And 10%, about 10% of them died.
Yeah.
Oh, let me interject here that even though 12 million came out from the transatlantic slave trade, over 20 million went out from the East African slave
East,
trade, from
China.
the North African slave trade, yes, to India, to the Middle East, to China, to Saudi Arabia.
So if you had to calculate the amount of people who left through north, east, west,
Over
south.
20 million.
Oh,
Quite a
probably-
lot, over
probably
30-something million
yeah.
people. They literally,
They just took.
That's a population of several Caribbean countries
Yes.
together.
yes,
So it's almost like wiping the Caribbean clean
Taking
if
up
we
everybody
think
from
about
the Caribbean
it.
and
Yeah.
sending them over.
yes.
Systematically, the Africans were hunted, captured, and then sold.
That's true. That's true. That's a fact. It was a matter of supplier and the person who needs it.
So as demand as
Right.
demand increased,
So they
supplies
caught more.
increased.
And so that was one of the greatest purposes for the guns. Because with the guns, if you fight a war, for example, and you subdue a population of people, then it's easier for you to take 2,000 people. Because if a tribe is coming to you with bows and arrows, and you're coming to them with guns blazing,
Yeah.
one side
and
will win.
especially if they're not accustomed to guns,
Right.
they will definitely be fearful.
Then you can
Yes.
subdue them, take 2,000 of them, take them to the
You
coast.
you can annihilate a whole village,
Yes, you could.
a whole
And then,
population.
in addition to what Kamali was saying, when you're taking these people to the coast, there is a trade going on in there too. You're meeting middlemen. And one guy may say to you, well, I like that girl, so sell her to me. And he would sell that girl to you. So even though you have a consignment of Africans going to the coast,
along
You
the
might
way.
along
sell
the way,
two, sell three.
you may sell a few, and you're trading
So
along the way.
some might even
Some
remain
in Africa.
but in a
yes.
different part.
in a different part,
Precisely.
while some are shipped off to the
Precisely.
Caribbean.
So it was an intricate business, and we cannot look at it through
And
the
nobody
lens
cared that
through a
families were
single lens.
displaced.
Oh no. Oh no.
You have to understand, it's easy in the Caribbean for us to differentiate it because it's white against black. But in Africa, it was ethnicity. It wasn't black enslaved black people. Yes, they did, but it was different. It was more so different ethnicities. And so,
Or you can even boil it down to tribes.
well, yeah, Fulani will go and make war against another group of people because they wanted to get slaves, and they would do that. But it's because my beliefs and your beliefs are two different beliefs, so it's okay. I could go and I could capture you. It's fine. Yes, people would capture people in their own ethnic grouping, but it was more so different ethnicities. So yes, Africans did help with the enslavement of Africans, but they were different ethnicities, just like the Romans enslaved other white
The
people.
Gauls, the Britannics,
Yes.
the Germanics.
Yes, just like they did that, that also happened in Africa.
You said families were kept apart and people who spoke the same language were
Separated.
Was
separated. Yes.
So essentially what you had is when packing a slave ship, a captain didn't get all of his slaves from one place. If there were, for example, 5 ports along the coast, he's going to take 10 here, 10 there, 10 there, 10 there. The reason being, when you have a mixed up batch of slaves or
Prevents
commodity,
collusion.
it prevents collusion because one, more than likely, we don't speak the same language.
Yes.
And two, we're not the same people. So if I can't
Ethnicity
communicate,
comes into it again.
If I can't communicate to Miss Black, I can't say Miss Black tomorrow.
Can
we're
you
going to
sign
revolt.
language?
Because I'm saying something, she's saying something, nobody can understand.
Like
each
the
other.
Tower of Babel in
and
the
many of
Bible.
them are also enemies too.
Right,
They
and
were
I
from
don't like
enemy
you.
So I don't
nations.
trust
Right.
you.
Right.
So I wouldn't
Yeah.
fight for you. And so what you had is, I find the middle passage very interesting because one, they selected them randomly. The second thing was how they packed them on the ships. So you had special ships called slavers. And the difference with the slavers were they were particularly built with shells that they could put down to stack the slaves on them.
Wow.
And you had two different styles of packing. I think this is the
Loose
last topic I
packing.
taught before school closed.
Loose
Loose packing,
packing
where
and-
you might fold the ship to maybe 75% capacity, so you
You
can
get
lie
some
down,
room.
you have like a space
You're
to stretch
flexible.
off. And then you have what is called tight packing, where the captain is going to say, hey, some of them get dead, so I'm going to pack extra. I'm going to pack extra. So when the 10% dead, then I have a full ship of slaves to carry on. And in that situation, you literally have people squeezing up on people.
Can't breathe.
The
Can't breathe.
conditions under the middle passage were deplorable. Imagine you're in the bottom of a ship. You're moving across the tropics for
So
maybe
one
2
second.
months.
Before we get to the bottom of the ship, the men were below generally and the women were on the upper deck.
It depended on the captain of the ship. I don't know if in slavery you can have anything called benevolence. Maybe you can have level of kindness. But I don't know if you, when
You
you,
can have
if
compassion.
you're a slave owner, I don't know what is benevolent about that. So yes, it depended on the captain, it depended on the ship. In some cases, women and men were packed. The women would be separate from the men, but sometimes women were allowed to stay on board at the top, on deck, or in a different place. Children too, but mostly the men, who probably would be the warriors that you caught in the war.
Yes, the
They
aggressive
would be the
ones.
ones who they would ensure that are secured.
Secured.
So there are times, yes, when you have women who are also secured, but more so they made sure that men were secured.
And people jumped overboard.
Yes, they did.
Trying to swim back to
Africa, yes, they did. Because
and it was stated that in some instances they didn't mind jumping overboard and dying because they felt that
they were going back home.
their spirits would return
Would
home.
return
Yes,
to
precisely.
to the motherland.
And
as
so
you would hear.
eventually you would have a slave ship now that would put a net around the sides of the ship. So if you try to jump over,
You
they'll
just
catch
drop
you.
into the net and they pull
And
you
you
back
They
up.
will pull you back in.
And you probably
then-
get a good lashing
Yeah,
and then they put underneath.
Exactly.
Precisely.
Oh, yes, yes,
Exactly.
Burn your free paper, you go back down with everybody else. 'Cause obviously
Until you
can't handle freedom.
until you become submissive.
And so that was a whole part of the middle passage.
This segment, I'm thinking about leaving Africa, and I want people who are watching to understand the
So you
trauma.
want to hear about the slave force?
What I normally,
the
what
trauma.
what I would normally say to my students is, imagine a spaceship came and you're seeing your family, you're seeing everything that you know, and some strange looking person, because the whites were also strange
To them.
people to many
Yes.
of these Africans. They've never seen somebody with such pale skin. And imagine that the spaceship comes and just rip you away from them, and you are seeing them leaving, and you don't know what these people are going to do to me. Many of the slaves thought that they were going to be eaten. Many of the slaves felt that these people were going to have us for dinner. So they were literally scared. Before they left the factories or the fort, Elmina is one that comes to
Fort
mind.
Elmina.
They were there for months in a dark dungeon. Even the Africans there, they would, any vices that you may have, if you try to revolt, they would punish you. They do all sorts of things to disorient you, so that you just,
You become submissive?
I don't know how to explain this,
But
but
let
it's-
Kamali explain this
Go
to
ahead,
me,
Kamali,
because
see if you can.
I
So-
am sitting here and let me tell you,
I don't think they were submissive at that point.
I
I
think it's just a method of
don't
letting them
like
understand I
don't
dominate you.
like to discuss slavery.
Why?
It's a painful topic.
It causes me to become hurt, heartbroken, and it causes me as well to feel anger.
Yes.
That anger creates a passion within me. This can't happen again.
Never.
We must
Never
never,
again.
allow it,
allow
to, happen again. Ever, ever, ever.
And that is why it must be taught. A lot of people say, why don't you let this history die? This is
no.
a truth that must never
but
die.
the Jews,
Stick a pin It was actually 10 million people who were killed in the Holocaust, and many of them were black people, people of mixed ancestry. It was not the Jews alone, it was only 6 million Jews.
And fine, but I'm
Yes.
saying they will never ever
Let it
forget
go.
their
But
history.
you should
They're
let go.
not
Never.
allowing
No.
it to go any place.
No.
It is real, it's
Yes.
alive, it's active in the Jewish community, and might I say across the globe. Why is it that 12 million Africans must be forgotten, plus the 1.5 or 1.8 that are skeletons at the bottom of the Atlantic?
They will never be forgotten.
It will never, ever happen again.
And do you know, Paula, in Africa, this history is not taught.
Yeah, they don't know.
I'm
The
coming to
children
that.
don't know that.
I'm coming to that.
But yes, it is really sad. I think it's just a matter of what is white is right. You know, if it's black, it's really unnecessary.
We're at the
And
slave
so
port.
You have right. If you look at the slave ports, one of the most well-known ports would have been Fort Elmina, which a lot of people, once you do Caribbean history, you will hear about Fort Elmina. So what you have is a slave port, a massive fortress on the coast, and literally you have everything happening here. It is like a modern commercial port. You have persons negotiating how many slaves they want, how much ivory they want, how much this they want, how much palm oil they want, what they're willing to sell. You have people who live there. You even have people who might work for customs saying, okay,
had
you're taking away 20
immigration.
slaves, $5. You know, that's the
This
customs
was
charge.
serious
It was
business.
serious business. And then you would have in not even a small, maybe a very dark, stink, unsanitary dungeon, hundreds of Africans in one little cell. Sometimes they were poorly lit. Many were poorly ventilated.
They can't lie down. They can't
You
sit down.
lie
They stand,
down.
you know.
You literally have to stand up for
Standing
long
room
periods of
only.
time. You're shackled.
If they were not shackled, they would be in standing room. It's just standing room. The door is locked, and standing room. You can't.
Stuffy.
Yes.
You can't really move around.
Many of them died, you
and
know.
the only purpose of that is to hold you until a ship comes. Because as we said before, you would have some consignments. So
And
in 2
if the
months, we
ship-
know a ship is coming for 100 slaves, so we make sure, okay,
And
at
if
least
that
100
ship is
survive.
delayed,
Well, you're tapping
Well-
longer.
Yes.
more punishment.
It depends on your relationship, though, with the trader, with the merchant in England or in any other part of Europe. Because some slaves you could sell just like that. But then some of them develop the business relationship to the point where they knew, okay, Kamali's coming for 200 slaves, so we need to preserve 200 slaves of
And you might be
Kamali's
getting
ship.
a better price from Kamali than you get
Precisely.
from someone else.
Precisely.
And it went as far as, let me tell you something, right? The institution of slavery was so interesting. When I tell you it's a business, every single European country has no excuse because each of them had a company set up for slavery. Britain had the Royal African
Except for
Company.
Spain. Not Spain.
You had, who was it, Holland? I think you had the Brandenburg
The Dutch.
Company.
The Dutch had
the
the-
Middleburg Company.
Yeah.
You had the Compagnia Gaditana. And all of these companies, they have different names, you know.
Yes.
But all of them were practically state-owned companies that just participated
And
in
they
slavery.
profited from
And
slavery.
they
Yes, they
profited
did. Yes, they did.
exponentially.
And we are coming up to the middle passage in the next segment. We are at the middle passage. How are the Africans feeling?
Oh, emotionally disturbed.
And seasickness. They've never been rocking like that. Seasickness, emotionally disturbed. This is totally different. This is totally strange. You're a prisoner in a strange situation.
And they're accustomed to planting and harvesting their own
They're accustomed
food,
to their own
eating
cultural-
healthily.
Yes.
And now you're on a food ration.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yes.
The conditions aboard the Middle Passage were absolutely horrendous. If you ever want to talk about a public health and public sanitation crisis, a slave ship was a public sanitation crisis.
I was thinking about it today, and I started to feel a little bit squirmish because you're talking about people, especially not the loosely packed ones,
The tightly
but the
packed.
tightly packed sardine ones, dried, they excreted,
Right there.
dried on them.
Yes.
Then they do it again
Yes.
and again and
Yes.
again.
Probably maggots and,
And-
other,
and
other
urinated.
germs manifest
And like-
themselves.
And then the
And-
ladies with their monthly
Oh,
menstrual cycle.
These things didn't matter.
But this is what
and
I'm
again, I was saying to you, it depended on the relief that these Africans got depended on the benevolence of the captain.
Will you
So
stop
if the
using that
captain
word?
says,
There's
But
no
no, but that's
benevolence.
what they have to use in
The-
order
There's
to
no
justify it.
benevolence
And the
in
kindness-
slavery.
That's what they
do
say.
we want to use the word kindness or
I
the
don't know what
goodness?
it is.
Because they could keep you down there as long as they wanted to, or if you had a captain who cared about the lives of the Africans,
They
they
would
would
come
bring
up on
them
stuff,
aboard.
you know.
They would wash them down with salt water. They would get them to clean.
Bearing in mind, when he has more slaves to deliver, he makes more money.
Yes, and
So maybe
yes.
it's not even benevolence
interest
and
is keeping them
compassion and all
Precisely,
of that.
precisely.
Remember, there were insurance schemes
Precisely,
as well,
yes.
included in all of
Right.
this.
So
So he wants to make sure that he gets some
that
money.
right that
The commodities must
the-
reach.
Yes.
So I mean, but then even though one of the reasons why they packed tightly is we're gonna try and make this quick rush, and if we lose 10%, it's okay. We still have, we still would have a unit of slaves, because when you pack that ship till you can't hold another African, it would be called a unit of slaves, right? And so that was the situation on board. So like I was saying, it depended on the captain who was there. If the captain did not care, then
Pack them.
they would stay
Do
underneath.
you realize that these people who died, living martyrs, are shackled to them
Yeah.
in some instances? So somebody might die overnight, and that corpse is lying next to you.
Yes.
Do you realize why some of these slaves might have jumped overboard?
A common
It's
practice.
mental, they develop mental
Yes,
issues.
yes.
A common practice would have been, if, for example, one slave dies of a disease, you will have 10 being thrown overboard. Because if, for example, all of us are chained together, in the mind of the captain, there's a possibility if I have the disease, he has it, she has it, and she has it.
So it's
here,
like
dash everybody
coronavirus.
Yes.
over. Right.
All the
And
people with
they
whom
are
you come in
insured.
contact,
For the most part,
we have to quarantine
most
you,
part-
but for them, they threw them
They
overboard.
threw them over.
But for the most part, the Africans were insured, so they would be assured of a repayment.
Yes.
For those Africans.
Yes.
So the lives of the Africans were not considered.
Valuable.
They were not
It
valued.
was just something to
It
make
was-
money.
And when they refused to eat the slop,
Oh,
That
no.
they fed them. They
they
break out their
punched out
teeth.
their front teeth.
Yes, yes, to feed them.
And then push the food down their mouth. Because if your teeth aren't there to block, it has to go in.
How long were the trips from Africa to
Between
America?
6 to 8 weeks.
6 to 8 weeks.
If the weather was really bad, also you
A
may
little
take a little
longer.
longer.
Delayed.
But they
But-
really try to get from Africa to the Americas is a dash.
In about 2 months.
Yeah,
They try
it's a
to
dash.
move
They're
as
trying to
fast as
move as
possible.
fast as possible to get this cargo
The faster
off.
you move, the less of
Yes.
them die, the more money you can make.
Precisely.
You realize that by the time these people were on board the ships for a couple of days, the dignity is gone.
Well, me done dead long time.
Indignity wouldn't even be gone. It's a matter of people tend to
Dignity
think
is
of
gone.
just the middle passage, but it might be a situation where they took maybe 2 months to even reach to the coast. If you take them from the deep interior, it might be a 2
So by the
months
time
march
they
to the
reach
coast.
to the coast,
they stay
dignity
in
is
the
gone.
slave fort for however long.
The
and then
trauma
the actual
alone,
middle passage.
I wonder if trauma is transgenerational. I wonder if we still suffer
I
from that
am
trauma.
coming to that because I do believe that. So I'm coming to that eventually. But these are the words that I associate with the slave trade and the middle passage. Inhumane, cruel, wicked, heartless, hateful, abominable.
Yes.
And I could go on and,
And
on.
on.
It angers me. But at the end of the day, you cannot remain angry. What you have to do is replace the anger with a desire, like I said,
To do
to
better.
never allow this to happen
You're
again.
a Christian, right?
Yes.
Have you ever heard the hymn Amazing Grace?
Yes.
Do you know the origin of that hymn?
Oh, Lord.
And so the story goes, there was a captain of a slave ship.
His
and
name
as-
is John Newton.
John Newton, right?
Yes.
And as he is on this ship bringing slaves across the Atlantic, to hear the cries and the wailing and the noise and the absolute uncomfortableness of the slaves underneath moved this man so much that he literally wrote a hymn, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Another thing about him is his first ship the first ship, the Duke of Argyle, is a shipment of slaves that he brought to Antigua. And that is worth mentioning. The slaves tried everything on that ship to revolt. He speaks at length about every single day that on his way to Antigua. And he was one of the kind captains. later on, after he was done with his trade, he was supposed to have done a fourth passage, because each passage would take 2 years, basically a 2-year run to get from the triangular trade would take about 2 years. He then, his conscience held on to him, and he became a Christian.
Yes.
And he became one of the British abolitionists who spoke out against slavery. And they used his testimony to speak out about the horrors of the Middle Passage. So, you know, at first he started off bad. I don't know if we can forgive him, but I guess we have to. But
but he ended well.
Eventually, because of his testimony,
but we must never forget.
Yes.
But because of his testimony, this is a actual person who has gone through this situation. Because of his testimony, it was able to sensitize quite a lot of people in Britain
agony of slavery.
To the agony of slavery.
And I heard about a little girl from Africa who was actually given to the sailors.
Yes, I read an account of that,
Yes.
where when she was on the coast, the Africans, and they did it all the time. Whenever the sailors, the European sailors came, they would give them to, they would give them any amount of women, and they were until she died. Yes, I read that account somewhere. I can't remember exactly where I read it, but yes, that happened. But that was just one of the many accounts that happened.
You see, these people did not value our lives.
Oh, no.
They did not value our lives. And it's heart-wrenching, because I could not treat anyone like that.
No.
Never mind your ethnicity, never mind your race, your religion. I'm Christian. If you choose to believe in wood, the sun, the whatever, notwithstanding all differences, I just don't have the heart to do it. And I don't know that marijuana and cocaine and these types of drugs were available at that time. And they say these are the drugs that will cause your mind to be altered. What altered their minds that they could treat people in such a way? Money and greed.
It's the root of all evil, money.
Look,
that was it. It's just about money.
This was big money.
I understand. So what you're trying to tell me is that there are people who will do anything for big money.
Even today?
Even today. There was a story of a prince who was inadvertently sold as a slave, ended up in Brazil.
Yes.
And his father did everything under the sun
to get him back.
Actually, he was returned to his father.
Yes. But there were actually two princes. One, his mother tried to get him back, and she couldn't get him back. He was sold into slavery in Brazil. And he actually had an uprising in Brazil. He had a revolt in Brazil because he was a prince. The other young prince, even though he was taken there, he saw the horrors of slavery. When he was returned, he continued to sell slaves. The situation got to a point where there were African kings and noblemen who would send their children to Europe to be educated so that they could come back to Africa, learn the ways of the European, manage the business of slavery. So it was really, it was a good business.
Like a conglomerate.
Yes, it was money.
Money has to be
slaves were currency. They were a form of currency.
Yes.
And if it was anything other than human cargo that were being sold, we would be praising Africa every day about the triangular trade.
If it was cattle.
It was cattle.
Yeah.
You know?
But
because
not people.
Not people.
Not people.
But you see, the beliefs of the day, that is how people thought in the time. Maybe if you were there at the time, maybe if Kamali and myself were there at the time, we probably would have thought that way because that's what we grew up seeing. You think the way that you do today, because you were taught differently. You have a different sense of morale, a modern day morale, and we always judge this peculiar institution with modern day mentalities. And yes, we should in some ways, because it must never ever happen again. But back then,
it was the acceptable thing.
It was the acceptable thing. And you will find out even more when we speak about the black slave masters. It was the acceptable thing.
Arrival in the Americas, in the Caribbean, Barbados was said to be the first stop.
Not all the time. They usually would know where they're going. Like I said to you, John Newton, when he came on the Duke of Argyle, he came straight to Antigua.
He came straight to Antigua
from Africa. So it depended on where you were going to go.
And on the, probably dependent on the consignment as well.
Precisely.
The ordering.
And then slaves could leave Antigua and taken to St. Kitts, to Nevis, or a ship could go to Nevis,
so like
because
a distribution hub. So we
precisely,
drop 100 here and a smaller boat takes
because
you could,
it could be random or it could be pre-ordered.
And then there was also an inter-island slave trade as well that was going on. So it wasn't just the transatlantic slave trade, it was the inter-island slave trade. So I could sell a slave to somebody in St. Kitts, somebody in St. Kitts.
Friends and they say, oh, I need 20 slaves. Well, I have 20 extra. Let me send them over on a boat for you.
Precisely.
Or it could be that your ladies are reproducing quite a lot.
Or maybe I own plantation in more than one country.
Like Sir Christopher Codrington.
Yes, because
he owned plantation in Barbados,
Antigua, Barbuda.
So he would send his slaves in
all
between.
over the place. So it was, that again was another economic web of, it didn't have any particular, the ships would know exactly where they're going once they left, but it didn't all go to Barbados. They would go to different territories in the Caribbean. According to the demand.
But perchance a ship arrived in Barbados with 1,000 slaves, but there were orders from other islands coming north. But somehow in Barbados they said, listen, we need 800 slaves. But what they actually ordered would have been about 500. So they sold the 800 slaves. It means somebody's going to be short of slaves.
They would have sold the excess.
They worked it out.
Yeah.
They knew how to work it out.
Kept their consignments and say, okay, another boat is coming next week, then you can fill.
Yes, because
so we will give you a 500.
Ships were always coming.
Ships were coming on a regular
Let me tell you
basis.
something. Let me tell you something.
So ships were coming more
couldn't
than
be
once per
without
month.
slaves.
But let me say something to
couldn't
you.
be without a slave. Ships came.
Let me explain something to you, Paula. During the time of the slavery, the time of each mother country, each European metropolitan country that owned colonies, they all had mercantilism as their method of economic method of gaining money. And they would say, listen, I am in charge of Antigua. France is not allowed to trade with any goods with my colonies.
Yes, the Navigation Act.
You understand? Under the Navigation Act. However, one of the few items that anybody could trade with any country was slaves.
So sugar might have been a different.
You can't trade sugar. No. A British colony cannot trade with a Dutch ship with sugar. But they could trade for slaves. So if the Dutch would come with a consignment of slaves, then they would be able to trade for sugar.
Because what you had in those days, you had something called the Navigation Acts.
Yes.
And so the Navigation Acts were set up to establish preferential trade. British colonies trade with Britain. Spanish colonies trade with Spain. French colonies trade with France. That was the system. The Netherlands, same thing.
Yes.
Slaves are free ground.
Yes.
If you want 20 slaves in France or 20 slaves, then get 20 slaves. That was probably the only thing that was universal to everybody.
When
it came to the other cash crops, the sugar, the molasses, the rum, etc., it was streamlined.
Let's move on. Let's move on.
Because labor was important.
Labor was important.
Labor was very, very important. And they needed, so ships were always coming. Ships were always coming.
Based on what you're saying, ships were always coming. Sounds like buses leaving old roads, make a trip to St. John's, and then return, and you collect commuters.
Remember, in the Americas initially, they did not promote natural reproduction because it was cheaper to buy a slave, and a slave probably had a shelf life That sounds funny.
Of 10
It has
years.
about 7 to 10
you know.
years, and
They
after
could work
that,
for 10 years, then dead, you just
after
replace
that you
them.
die or you old, you can't do anything. We might, you know, you just sit there. I don't know. But then what they would do is keep bringing the amount of
Replenish
slaves,
the stock.
replenishing the stock.
Okay, on the auction block,
Yes.
they're looking for teeth and
Well, let's explain this. Because when they come from the Middle Passage now, most likely these slaves who have been in these Africans who have been in the hull of a ship, they have
Dirty.
dysentery, they smell awful.
They're slim.
They would bathe them.
Oh,
They
finally
would
they
rub
get
their
in the
skin
bath.
down
Yes, they would.
with
Oil,
oil and
palm
or
oil.
fat.
Proper
And
advertisement.
hear this, and then they would stuff their rectum because they may have diarrhea. And they don't want them to seem as if they have diarrhea and they're sick. So they would do all of these things
To make them look as healthy
to make
as
them look as
possible.
healthy as possible.
So they could get a good price.
so they could get a good
Right.
price.
So they can
yes.
say, oh yes, this one looks good.
Yes.
So when I remember teaching when I was teaching my third form this, they were so insulted because I was like, do you understand how little these people were? They would literally go. Imagine you're a black man. You're standing up. They're going to open your mouth.
And
they're
they're
going to be
naked.
hitting your hand. They're going to be
Your
hitting your
knees.
foot. They're going to be hitting your knees. They're going to be pulling you. They're going to be tugging you to make sure that everything is as it should be. And the only thing you can do is stand up there and take it.
And you're probably naked.
And
Yes,
you are,
most
of
likely
course, you're
naked, yes.
completely naked. If you were naked, it wasn't even a matter of debate.
I read a story the other day, the story's on my bed right now, of an African trader who was very, very wealthy because of this. In fact, when he died, 6 of his slaves were killed and buried with him in Africa. So we have, they used to call these slave owners
Sounds
sugar
like the
barons.
Egyptians when they died
Right,
and
right.
they killed slaves.
They used to
with
be
them.
called sugar barons because in the British colonies, they became so wealthy.
That they controlled everything.
So wealthy.
In those days, you did have a situation where, you know, the British colonies were semi-democratic. So they did have some sort of legislative council or parliament. But then it was always a situation where you had an income requirement. So you had to be of a certain wealth level to stand for elections or to even
Yes,
vote.
to vote.
So it's bad enough that I control the economic standpoint of a British territory, but then you give me absolute political power as well. So you had a situation where the colonial legislative assemblies tended to have more power and influence than the British governor. And that was probably one
Well,
of the reasons
the
for
thing
Crown
is,
Colony
the thing
rule.
is too, the thing is too, what they had was the colonial secretary. So they would make a law. If they made a law in the each one of the individual islands had to make their own laws, but they tended to follow each other. And guess what? Antigua is always the one who's ahead of all of them, you know, with making laws.
First,
Antigua was, yeah, man.
in a lot of things.
And they would follow suit, and then they would send these laws to the colonial secretary. Now, if the colonial secretary thinks that it's too harsh, then they would try and change it or tweak it and not modify it and then send it back to the Caribbean. But each one of the colonies had that autonomy, just like what Kamali was saying. Each of them had that autonomy to pass laws. And they passed laws about the slaves too, you know.
But that's the thing. If you're in charge, you're passing laws that govern the lives of these slaves, and you're not, as you say, benevolent, it therefore means
Majority of the slave control laws weren't benevolent either. It was just
No.
a matter of figuring
Yes.
out how to
it just
control them.
it
Well-
therefore means you could treat these people as you please.
Yes.
Who
And,
will
and
ever-
even though the laws were
who
there,
will
even
stop
though the
you?
laws were there, a lot of them went contrary to the laws, you know. Like, you can't tell me that this
And
is
it's not
my
as
property.
it's not as if you were traveling via aircraft, so you can just show up this afternoon on Virgin and catch them in the act. It's weeks and weeks and weeks of travel, so they
Yeah.
can do as they please.
And in all of it, it's only one slave master in the whole Caribbean, British Caribbean, that I've ever heard of that was actually killed, that was actually hung, executed for killing a slave, and that is in Nevis. I have never heard of it elsewhere.
Of any other account.
Of any other account, only in Nevis.
Well,
One.
listen, this is a 3-part program.
Yes.
And we've come to the end of part 1. And we
How
haven't
sad.
even touched the plantation as well. Thank you for staying with us on the Paula Show. We've come to the end of part 1 of our 3-part presentation about slavery, emancipation, and reparation. KamaliMannix and Angella Black will return next week for part 2 of our conversation. And remember, we'll also be speaking about the black slave owners in the Caribbean. Thank you for staying with us on The Paula Show, and have a good evening. Goodbye.